This video is for educational and infotainment purposes only. It is not intended to encourage or glorify the use of drugs, violence, or criminal activity in any way. As a drug smuggler for Colombia's Medellin cartel, Barry Seal earned as much as $500,000 per flight smuggling cocaine into the United States. By 1983, his group had made over 100 flights, bringing in an estimated 56 tons of cocaine, making him one of the wealthiest people in all of America. Then it all came crashing down when he was busted, at which point Barry Seal had to make a decision: simply go to prison or risk life and limb to cooperate with the feds and double-cross one Pablo Escobar in an effort to avoid prison time. So what decision did he make? Well, you're about to find out. I'm Joshua Roberts, attorney at law, and you are watching Lawyer Up. In today's episode, we are going to take a look at the life and times of Barry Seal. From a student pilot in Louisiana to military flight service, to his time as a commercial pilot for TWA, and then on to millionaire drug smuggler for the Medellin drug cartel. We're going to look at it all. We will discuss his arrest and the work that he did as an undercover informant for the DEA until his cover was blown by his own government. We will then look at the various trials that he participated in, cooperating with the feds, and then a series of decisions that he would make that would ultimately define the final stages of his life. If you enjoy the video, hit that like button for me. If you got something to say, put it in the comment sections below. If you haven't subscribed, what are you waiting for? Smash that subscribe button. And you guys know it, I love it when you share my videos on social media. A lot of what we know about Barry Seal comes from the book Smuggler's End: The Life and Death of Barry Seal. It was written by Del Hahn, a former FBI agent who was part of the DEA task force that pursued Seal during the 1980s. And a lot of information also comes from Barry Seal's own lips in the form of his court testimony in multiple trials against co-conspirators. And the story begins when Barry Seal was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the son of Mary Lou and Benjamin Seal. Barry began to fly as a teenager, earning a student pilot certificate at 16 and a private pilot certificate at age 17. His flight instructor would describe him as a naturally gifted pilot. From there, Barry Seal joined the Civil Air Patrol in New Orleans, where he claims, in connection with other members of the patrol, that he started running covert operations for various government entities. Seal said that he started flying guns for the CIA to freedom fighters in Cuba and flying operations for the U.S. Army Special Forces in Laos just prior to the Vietnam War. Interestingly, Seal would meet Lee Harvey Oswald, the guy who assassinated JFK, while he was serving with the New Orleans Civil Air Patrol. From there, Seal enlisted in the Louisiana Army National Guard and ultimately graduated from the U.S. Army Airborne School. In 1964, Seal was hired by the now defunct Trans World Airlines, TWA, as a flight engineer. He was soon promoted to first officer, then captain, flying a Boeing 707 on a regular Western European route as one of the youngest command pilots in the entire TWA fleet. And even though Seal was now a commercial pilot, he still had his contacts from his military service days. And Seal's career with TWA would end in July of 1972 when he was arrested for his involvement in a conspiracy to smuggle 1,300 pounds of plastic explosives to anti-Castro Cubans. The criminal case associated with that event would eventually be dismissed, but TWA fired Seal anyway because of his participation in the scheme. Then unemployed, Seal would later admit that he turned back to the underground world and started smuggling small amounts of marijuana by air in 1976. By 1978, he had worked up to flying large loads of cocaine, for which there was a huge demand in the United States and what was a much more profitable cargo than marijuana. And things went relatively well until 1979, when Seal was arrested and jailed in Honduras on the return leg of a drug smuggling trip to Ecuador. Barry would spend 9 months in a Honduran jail after being caught with 40 kilos of cocaine. Ironically, also imprisoned at the same time in Honduras was another Louisiana pilot and smuggler, Emil Camp, and an Ellis McKenzie, who was a local Honduran smuggler. The three would become acquainted during their time, and Camp would later become one of Seal's closest associates in the smuggling business. And Seal's luck didn't end there. It would continue after his release from jail, as he would meet William Roger Reeves on the flight back to the United States. Now, Reeves was Jorge Ochoa's New Orleans cocaine distributor. And of course, the Ochoa family, along with Pablo Escobar, were the founders of the Medellin drug cartel based out of Colombia, South America. And those fellas would go on to make billions of dollars smuggling cocaine into the United States and abroad. And Barry Seal, who became known as El Gordo, or the Fat Man, would be an integral part of that success. So in 1981, Barry Seal began overseeing an operation that would smuggle cocaine for Pablo Escobar from Colombia to the United States. And this we know for a fact. What is much less clear is what else Barry Seal was doing during the 80s. And to fully understand this part of the story, you have to recall what was going on in the world of politics. So it's 1981, and we are still in the middle of the Cold War. Ronald Reagan is president of the United States, and those that know their presidential history know that his main focus was to keep communism from gaining a foothold in the Western Hemisphere at all costs. And the main agency that Reagan tasked to assist him in doing so was the CIA. Now, the U.S. already had some problems. Cuba and Fidel Castro were thorns in their side, and by 1980, Daniel Ortega and the communist Sandinistas had gained control of the government in Nicaragua, further threatening the United States in President Reagan's eyes. So starting in about 1981, the U.S. backed a resistance group generally referred to as the Contras in Nicaragua. Contra is short for La Contra-Revolucion, or counter-revolution in English, and their mission was to topple the communist government run by the Sandinistas, who had taken control. Now, the Contras were initially backed by the United States, both financially and with arms. But after they engaged in some terroristic attacks and some human atrocities came to light, public opinion of the U.S.'s support of the Contras began to wane, and then Congress pulled all of their funding. But that would mean that the communists would win, and Reagan wasn't about to let that happen. So President Reagan, by and through the CIA, continued to covertly support the Contras by, number one, selling arms to Iran and funneling that money to the Contras in what blew up into a little thing that we now know as the Iran-Contra scandal, and number two, by using the CIA to protect drug trafficking in an effort to raise money to fund its fight against communism. And there is substantial evidence that the CIA turned a blind eye to Barry Seal's drug running during this time in order to use him to deliver weapons and money to Nicaraguan rebels. In fact, this is one of the main storylines of the movie American Made, starring Tom Cruise as Barry Seal. And while we know that the movie is full of fictions, there are nuggets of truth to be had therein. Now, author and FBI agent Del Hahn states in his book, quote, "There is no evidence to support the claims that Barry Seal smuggled drugs or guns for the CIA," end quote. He states in his research that the only confirmed connection he could make between the CIA and Barry Seal was in 1984, after Seal had started working as an informant for the DEA. However, the CIA doesn't answer to the DEA or the FBI or anybody else for that matter, except the President of the United States. So it's very possible that Seal had involvement with the CIA in the early 80s. Now, the extent of that involvement, well, that has provided fuel for speculation and all kinds of conspiracy theories for the past 40 years. But ultimately, who really knows? And that's up for you to decide. As for his dealings with the Medellin cartel, we know that Barry Seal was picking up kind of where George Jung and Carlos Leder had left off. It was those two who really revolutionized smuggling Colombian cocaine into the United States, flying planes up from Colombia to Norman's Cay, an island in the Bahamas that Carlos Leder had purchased and transformed into a transshipment and refueling point for hundreds of thousands of kilos of cocaine headed to the United States. While this was the primary means of transporting Colombian cocaine between 1978 and 1982, it had drawn a lot of law enforcement attention in Florida. And then after Norman's Cay was seized by the Bahamian authorities and Jung and Leder had a falling out, that avenue of smuggling basically was deserted. So Barry Seal and his group just kind of stepped in and moved their portion of the smuggling operation over to the west a little bit to the state of Louisiana. Seal's operation would include William Bottoms, his ex-brother-in-law, who was the main pilot in Seal's smuggling enterprise. Bottoms often flew with Emil Camp, while Seal oversaw the planning and operations. Seal's smuggling method was to use low-flying planes to airdrop drug packages into remote areas of Louisiana. They were then picked up by Seal's ground team and transported to Colombian distributors who still primarily remained in Florida. Within a year, Seal was utilizing over a dozen aircraft in his smuggling operation. And of course, the frequency of these flights attracted the attention of the Louisiana State Police and federal investigators, who were closing in on the activities of several drug cartels, with one DEA agent in particular, Kiki Camarena, making significant inroads into the Mexican drug cartel world. So to avoid this unwanted attention, Seal moved his operation to a little regional airport in Mena, Arkansas, where he did maintenance and modifications to improve the plane's carrying capacities and avionics. Seal's activities in Mena have also become the subject of rumor and controversy, but again, according to Seal's biographer, Agent Hahn, Seal did not use Mena as a drug transshipment point. Now, most people do not believe that is true, as there is substantial evidence that Seal relocated his operation to the small town of only 5,000 people because it had minimal law enforcement and he could carry out his smuggling operation, depending upon who you believe, either under the nose of or with the blessing of then Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. And at this point, Barry Seal was earning as much as $500,000 per flight smuggling cocaine into the U.S., and it was estimated that his guys were responsible for the illegal importation of $5 billion worth of drugs. The federal investigation into Seal was part of a larger undercover operation called Operation Screamer, in which over 80 pilots would ultimately be indicted. It was during this time that an informant would introduce Seal to an undercover DEA agent, who, after several months of interaction, negotiated a deal for Seal to smuggle 1,200 pounds of Quaaludes into the U.S. And when he did it, Barry Seal was immediately arrested by customs officers in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, busted. 2 indictments were returned against Seal in March of 1983. The first indictment charged Seal with 2 counts of conspiracy to distribute Quaaludes. A second indictment charged Seal and 3 other defendants with the distribution of Quaaludes, phenobarbital, and the opioid painkiller Demerol. Seal's attorney would then attempt to broker a deal with the prosecutors, but none was offered. And so he was tried over the course of a month in February of 1984 and convicted on the first indictment. Facing a heavy sentence, Seal's attorneys abandoned negotiations with local prosecutors and contacted the National Drug Task Force, a special program that was run out of the office of then Vice President George Bush. And they got an interview. Afterwards, DEA agent Ernst Jacobson was so impressed with Seal's connections, especially the ones with the Ochoa family, that on March 28th of 1984, they signed an agreement to allow Seal to serve as a DEA informant in exchange for a reduction of his prison sentence. Seal would then plead guilty to the second indictment and was released, with his ultimate sentence in both cases to depend on his performance as an informant. Lawyer Up is pleased to continue its partnership with Webull, the online broker that allows you to buy or sell stocks or crypto or whatever you're into directly from your computer or the mobile app on your phone. Webull is free to join, it's free to use, there is no cost to buy or sell, so it's commission-free trading. Better yet, when you sign up, link a bank account and deposit as little as 1 cent, Webull will give you at least 2 free stocks worth at least $3 per share. So it's free money as well. So if you would like to join the over 2 million Webull traders, all you have to do is click on the link in the description below this video and start trading today. The DEA's plan for Seal was to have him set up a cocaine purchase with the Ochoas, Escobar, and other cartel members, providing them with the basis for an indictment in the United States. There was only one problem. As it turned out, Seal personally had never dealt directly with Escobar. So he had to set up the meetings using the name of his associate, Ellis McKenzie, with whom they were familiar, but they also had never seen in person. So Seal, posing as McKenzie, flies down to Medellin for a meeting on April 8th of 1984. He was accompanied by a Miami-based cartel pilot who was unaware of Seal's role as an informant. Participants in this meeting included Pablo Escobar himself, as well as other high-level Medellin cartel members. It was at this meeting that Seal learned that the Colombian government had just conducted a major raid on the cartel's manufacturing facilities in the jungle, and so they were making arrangements to move their production and shipping operations to Nicaragua, where they had struck a deal with Presidente Daniel Ortega to be protected. But they weren't ready for that yet. So Seal's first shipment was to be a direct flight from Colombia to the United States, and it would take place about 6 weeks after this meeting, and it did not go well. In fact, the overloaded plane actually crashed at the Colombian airfield on takeoff. So the cartel scrambles to find a new plane, but the replacement plane was smaller and lacked the fuel capacity to make a direct flight all the way to the United States. So they arranged for a stopover in Nicaragua. Problem solved, right? Yeah, except that there was some confusion about where exactly this stopover would occur, which led to Seal's plane being fired upon and hit by Nicaraguan military units. The plane was hit, and so Seal had to make an emergency landing at the Sandino International Airport in Managua. It was a big scene. The military rolls up, finding a plane full of drugs, and of course, Seal and his co-pilots were taken into custody. Fortunately, the cartel had its deal with Ortega, so Seal would be released to the cartel's Nicaraguan contact, Federico Vogon, who worked for the Minister of the Interior. So disaster was averted. And guess who else just happened to be in Managua at the time? It was Pablo Escobar, who was in town setting up his new cocaine production lab. So after the two had a chat, Escobar decided to just keep the first shipment in Nicaragua and have Seal, who they still think is Ellis McKenzie, right, return to the States to buy a better plane. So Seal returns to the United States in search of a bigger bird. The plane that Seal acquired was a C-123K Thunder Pig, a large aircraft used primarily for military transport and capable of carrying heavy loads. But remember, he was still an informant. So before returning to Nicaragua, the DEA arranged for the CIA technicians to install hidden cameras inside of this plane. So with his new plane that he nicknamed the Fat Lady, Seal returns to Nicaragua on June 25th of 1984. The pickup went as planned this time, and the cameras successfully photographed, in what are now classic narco snaps, Seal and several Nicaraguan soldiers loading cocaine into the plane, aided by Pablo Escobar and Federico Voga. This time, the flight went off without a hitch, and upon his return to the United States, Seal landed at the Homestead Air Force Base in Florida. From there, the drugs were transported into a Winnebago camper owned by his Colombian contact. Now, at this point, the feds had a dilemma. They couldn't just let those drugs get away and be distributed, but they also couldn't arrest them right there at the airport because it would be obvious that it was a setup and that Seal was a narc. So the DEA agents staged an accident with the camper, and when the driver ran, they intentionally allowed him to escape because their only concern at the time was securing the drugs. Unfortunately, local law enforcement was not in on the scheme, and the fleeing driver was apprehended by city cops. So despite their efforts, the circumstances of the seizure raised suspicions with the cartel. From there, Seal made one more trip to Nicaragua on July 7th, taking money to Escobar. Now, another shipment was also planned for this time, but under instructions from the DEA, Seal told Escobar that his landing site was under DEA surveillance and it was unsafe for transport. So Seal would return to the U.S. without any cargo. Now, the DEA's plan was to keep Seal working with the cartel to gain intel on other parts of the supply chain, such as the location of this new cocaine production facility in Nicaragua and the smuggling airfields that they were using in Mexico. However, somebody blew the whole undercover operation. First, the leaked information was shared by a U.S. military commander who made a speech stating that the U.S. had evidence that elements of the Nicaraguan government were involved in drug smuggling. Then a very detailed account of American efforts in Nicaragua appeared in a July 17th article written by reporter Edmund Jacoby that was published on the front page of the Washington Times. And although not mentioned by name, the story detailed Seal's exact mission as evidence, which obviously gave enough information to implicate him, and it spelled an end to his fieldwork with the Medellin drug cartel. Following the article, the DEA had to move quickly to arrest the cartel distributors in Miami. And despite the leak, the DEA was still able to snag chief cartel supervisor in Miami, Carlos Bustamante, who was arrested along with several other cartel employees. And this was historic because the evidence acquired from those arrests, plus the evidence gathered by Seal, provided the basis for the first drug trafficking indictment in the United States against Pablo Escobar and several members of the Ochoa family. From there, and despite being outed somewhat, Seal was able to put together a second major undercover operation for the DEA. This operation involved a cocaine shipment from Bolivia. Now, Seal was somewhat compromised, so his ex-brother-in-law, William Bottoms, made the flight in January of 1985, but the mission was successful and led to several arrests and convictions. Then in February of 1985, Seal played a central role in a third undercover operation against Norman Saunders, who was the chief minister of the Turks and Caicos Islands, who was also successfully prosecuted. So Barry Seal was a huge help to the DEA and Florida Drug Task Force officers. However, the authorities in Louisiana were less impressed with his assistance and were still seeking prison time. So Seal decided to push back publicly against these investigators by appearing in a television news series broadcast by WBRZ in Baton Rouge. The series was titled Uncle Sam Wants You and ran on 5 consecutive evenings. It included an interview where Seal denied he was a smuggler and claimed he was being harassed by the government. And it worked, at least in the short term. As soon after the broadcast, the various law enforcement agencies met to work out an agreement that would allow Seal to continue to work and to testify as a witness in the several upcoming trials. They also agreed that the sentence for Seal's Louisiana cases would be no greater than the sentence he received in his Florida cases, with both sentences to run concurrently. And that, as it turned out, was a big, big deal. Now, here's where the TV appearance failed him. If you recall, Seal was known to the Medellin cartel members as the pilot named Ellis McKenzie. And it was not until the cartel members received a copy of Seal's television broadcast that they realized that the Ellis McKenzie that they knew was actually a guy named Barry Seal. And so, as you might expect, after his betrayal was discovered, he basically became a dead man walking. Mel Mermelstein, a high-level cartel distributor in Miami, would later testify in court that a few days after they discovered his true identity, he was told that the cartel wanted Seal either captured or killed. The price was $500,000 if Seal was murdered, or $1 million if he was captured alive. Mermelstein testified that he accepted the contract and then received a call from both Fabio Ochoa and Pablo Escobar, who thanked him for his help and gave him $100,000 for any upfront costs. But before Mermelstein could locate Seal, he was arrested by a federal task force in June of 1985, and surprisingly, he would tell authorities about the bounty that was out on Seal. So Seal was then informed about the hit and taken into protective custody, where he spent the next several months testifying in court. He was the primary witness in 3 trials. The trial of the Turks and Caicos officials in July, the trial of the Miami Medellin cartel distributors in August, and then finally the trial of the cartel distributors who had arranged the shipment of cocaine from Bolivia. All 3 trials resulted in convictions against all defendants. So following his testimony in these trials, Seal had completed his cooperation requirements with the feds, and it was time for Seal to face the music and be sentenced himself. Seal would then appear in 2 Florida courts for sentencing for his role in the Big Screamer investigation. But with the support of prosecutors and his DEA supervisors, he was ultimately sentenced to time served and received probation in both cases. And this was a huge deal, especially in his federal case, because he was otherwise facing a prison sentence of at least 10 years. So this was a great disposition for Seal in Florida. But remember, he still faced sentencing back in Louisiana. And the dilemma was this: the prosecutors in Louisiana had anticipated that Seal would serve substantial prison time in Florida when they agreed to run their sentences concurrent. But now, since there wouldn't be a prison sentence in Florida, they were still bound by the agreement, which meant they couldn't recommend prison time for Seal in Louisiana either. Which was crazy because Seal was pleading guilty to charges to which no one would ever avoid prison time given the quantities he was moving. Nevertheless, at Seal's sentencing hearing in January of 1986, and despite his dissatisfaction with Seal's failure to receive jail time in Florida, the judge honored the agreement. No prison time. The judge did set strict probation conditions and sternly warned Seal that if he violated any of the provisions, his probation would be revoked and he would be sent to prison. The probation conditions prohibited Seal from leaving Baton Rouge without written permission from the judge, banned Seal from employing armed security personnel, and ordered him to spend every night from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. at a halfway house for at least the first 6 months of his probation. Seal was then assigned to the Salvation Army's Community Treatment Center in Baton Rouge, and with that, In January of 1986, master smuggler Barry Seal walked out of the courthouse, avoiding all prison time in all cases. It was a miracle and a blessing. Or was it? As ordered by the judge, Barry Seal immediately took up residence at the Salvation Army building on US 61 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And he would stay there every night for about 3 weeks until the evening of February 19th of 1986. Barry arrived at the center that evening at approximately 6 p.m. and backed his white Cadillac into a parking space, totally unaware that a Colombian assassin was hiding behind one of the center's donation drop boxes. As Barry opened the driver's side door to get out of the car, a gunman rushed from behind the drop box and fired a .45 caliber MAC-10 machine gun, hitting Barry in the head and body 6 times. Seal would die almost instantly. The gunman hurried into a waiting Buick and sped away. Now, they wouldn't get far as they were quickly apprehended at the airport trying to flee the country. In the end, a total of 6 Colombians were arrested in connection with the murder. 3 of them, Luis Carlos Quintero Cruz, Miguel Velez, and Bernardo Antonio Vasquez, were indicted on state charges for capital murder. A 4th man was indicted separately on lesser charges, and evidence of direct involvement was insufficient for the final 2, who were ultimately released and then deported. In addition to the state charges against the killers, federal charges were filed against Fabio Ochoa, Pablo Escobar, and a 3rd cartel member, Rafael Cardona, for conspiring to murder Barry Seal. So from there, the attention turned to the murder trial of the cartel men accused of gunning down Barry Seal. Widespread publicity caused a delay of several months before the murder trial began, but it finally commenced in April of 1987 with one of the most important members and witnesses being Max Mermelstein. Mermelstein, who had told the DEA of the murder contract after his arrest in 1985, testified that Ochoa, Escobar, and Cardona not only asked him to take the contract and gave him money, but also provided the weapons to do the job. He also testified that Cardona had test-fired the murder weapon in his garage, and bullets that matched that weapon were later extracted from the garage wall by FBI forensics experts. Mermelstein also testified that after his arrest, defendant Miguel Velez, who was the driver of the getaway car, had asked Mermelstein to take over the hit on Barry Seal. There was also extensive eyewitness and forensic evidence against Quintero Cruz, Velez, and Vasquez. Vasquez was identified as the owner of the getaway vehicle, Velez as the driver, and Quintero Cruz as the gunman. Ultimately, all 3 were found guilty and sentenced to life without parole. As the dust was settling, the Louisiana Attorney General wrote the United States Attorney General, Edwin Meese, criticizing the government's failure to protect Seal as a witness. Meese then launched a federal investigation, but ultimately it was determined that no wrongdoing had occurred because Seal had knowingly placed himself in danger by refusing to remain in the witness protection program. And this fact was actually confirmed by his wife, Debbie Seal. And speaking of Debbie Seal, she insisted all along that she was totally unaware of what her husband was up to until after he was arrested. She says that she thought he was an airplane broker. Now, her character in the American-made movie is much more suspicious of her husband's activities, but in reality, she states, quote, "I trusted him, so I didn't ask questions. He would tell me I'm going to such and such places, and I took him at his word. And I never saw drugs, that's for sure." End quote. Ultimately, Barry Seal would be survived by his 3rd wife, Debbie, of 13 years, and his 5 children. So that's the end of the story, right? Well, not exactly. There still remains one question. Who leaked Seal's covert operations in Nicaragua to the press? And in 1988, the House Judiciary Committee held a hearing to look into that exact issue. And do you know who they pointed the finger at? It was Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. Remember all of that stuff about Ronald Reagan and the Contras that we discussed earlier? Well, during the committee hearings, DEA agent Ernst Jacobson testified that Iran-Contra figure Oliver North had attended 2 meetings about the sting operation, and he had the motivation to leak the information, because by linking the Sandinista government with drug trafficking, he might be able to sway public opinion and Congress back to funding the Contra rebels. Several others on the committee would also suggest that North was the source of the leak, including John Kerry, whose report stated that North, quote, decided to play politics with the issue, period, end quote. Interestingly, the guy that actually wrote the Washington Times piece that exposed SEAL, Edmund Jacoby, later said that North was not his source, and that it was a deceased Special Forces and CIA guy named Ted Lunger, who at the time worked as a staff member for Representative Dan Daniel. And for what it's worth, in an interview with Frontline, North would also deny leaking the information. So in the end, who knows who leaked the info? And although it was not directly tied to SEAL's murder, it certainly didn't help. So that is the episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you're interested in watching a fictionalized version of this story play out on the big screen, SEAL is portrayed by Tom Cruise in the film American Made. Thanks for watching today. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and share. I'm Joshua Roberts, attorney at law, and you've been watching Lawyer Up.